Hey everybody, and welcome to this Adobe MAX 2021 session. My name is Michael, and I am excited to be back at my 6th Adobe MAX talking about the application I use for all of my work, the application that shaped most of my career, the one and only Photoshop. Now, this session is called Photoshop for Visual Designers, Pro Tips and Techniques. Wait a minute, last year I gave a session called Photoshop for Visual Designers, Advanced Techniques and Tips, right?
Yeah, people really loved your session last year, Michael, so we'd like you to do that again.
Oh, okay, that's cool. My work's still very much the same, so.
Yeah, so more of the same, but different.
But different.
Yeah, I mean, we can't just re-air the same session, right?
Oh, obviously not, no.
So it would be great if you just gave your tips and techniques, but in a different way.
Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna do my very best. This session, like last year's session, is going to dive into how I use Photoshop for my visual design. Now, specifically, we're going to look at my work with app icons, and I'll walk you guys through some examples and breakdowns of how I get various results in Photoshop. We'll be deconstructing some icons I've made and talk about ways to get dimensionality and tactility into your designs. I'll show you how I use layer styles to bend light and make any materials from simple shape layers. So in the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to be talking a lot about app icons because that's a big passion of mine. But these tips and techniques are useful in many other areas of design, and I personally use it in all of my UI work for both web and apps and games and for illustrations. So even if you're not specifically producing this sort of work, my hope is that somewhere in this session, I'm going to show you at least one thing or one way of using Photoshop that you didn't already know or had thought of before. Now, the sort of visual design that I love to make is vibrant and playful. This pursuit of fun is everywhere, really, from the games that I help design to the interfaces and the websites that I make, and obviously also in the icon work that I do. And I use Photoshop in all of my work. And I think that in an age with many different tools available, I keep coming back to Photoshop because it holds the magic power of raster-based graphics. Now, even with all the great vector-based tools out there, not a lot of other applications can as flexibly and easily create and manipulate effects to deliver fun. Now, before we dive into what this fun is I keep talking about and how we make it, I want to tell you two things. First, I am sharing some PSD files that I made that you can download and study. They include some of my personal work and some of the things that we'll be taking a look at today. Now, with 30 minutes of session time, we don't have a lot of time to do step-by-step stuff. And so hopefully the files that I've supplied you with here will help you play around with this stuff more easily afterwards on your own time. And two, in last year's session, we talked a lot about materials and we made these orbs in Photoshop. I still highly recommend that you check out that session, and I've also included the PSD for the materials in the files for this session so that you can study those. However, I'll try to keep the examples in this year's session less theoretical and more specific to work that I have actually shipped. Now, we did go from advanced tips to pro tips after all, right? Great. Let's fake some dimensionality. Mac app icon design have always been a treasure trove of fun, and with the recent changes in Mac OS, we've seen Apple double down on dimensionality and materials in app iconography. Photoshop can do a lot of that stuff. So let's say that we want to make a new Finder app icon. I make some really nice templates for icons over at applypixels.com, but really all you need is a 1024 by 1024 pixel canvas. So we could just start by opening up Photoshop and creating a new document. 1024 by 1024 pixels is the largest size needed for macOS app icons. And we'll go down and make sure that the background color is transparent. Just hit create, and we can start to create our app icon in here. We could go over and use something like the rounded rectangle tool, for example, and we can sort of drag out a shape here. Oh, and here's a quick tip for you. We'll try to spice this thing up with little quick tips. The Shift key is a magical key in Photoshop, and holding down Shift key has all sorts of properties, but in the case of you dragging out a shape, it makes sure that the proportions stay equal so that you can get a perfect square. And we can use these live shape properties, which I love up here. We can go and say, okay, like maybe something like 120. Now we have like a rounded rectangle. But Apple doesn't really like rounded rectangles. They're not fancy enough. If you don't have the files for this session, you can totally get by with just doing a rounded rectangle. Most of the stuff that I'll be showing now can easily be applied to any shape. But for the purpose of being super accurate when doing macOS icons, I have provided some files, and you'll find the one called finder.psd in the folder. And so when you're creating modern macOS icons, you want to base it on the squircle shape, the super ellipse shape that Apple uses. And you'll notice it's a vector shape that has more nodes. It creates a sleeker curvature around there. You'll see that same base shape applied in the hardware design as well. And you can get that from the template file. There's also a bunch of rules when you do icons. We're not going to talk a lot about those rules in this session, but for the purpose of being accurate, in these template files, you'll also find a folder called grid plus padding, which, as you can see, shows you how normal app icons are supposed to be padded on the macOS platform. We're going to disable that again. It's not super important for now. I just wanted you to have those tools. Okay, how do we even begin to add some dimensionality into this? Well, one thing that we can do is change the color of the base, first of all. Let's go in, let's choose like a bluish hue. We're trying to make the Finder app icon, right? And so we kind of want, something like that. And the alumni of last year's session knows what's coming up. We're going to use the magic powers bestowed to us by Photoshop, layer styles. I'm going to right click this layer here, and I'm hitting blending options, which gives me access to the layer styles pane. And this is really where all the magic happens. And we kind of want this shape to look like it's like raised from the background. And one of my favorite ways of doing that is using inner glow. And as you can see, I'm using the blend mode multiply to sort of darken the outer areas of this whole shape. 50% opacity, I'm using a size 10. If this was bigger, like the shadow would be softer, kind of like this, but we want that small, subtle, sharp shadow. So that's a start. Now what we're gonna do next is apply some lighting to this whole shape. And there's more ways of making lighting in Photoshop than there are attendees at Adobe MAX. But here's one of my favorite ways of doing it. And let's make this as a quick tip. Here's Michael's cool way of adding masked gradient highlights. You'll see me coming down and adding a gradient to this. It's just going to be pure white to transparent white. We're going to hit reverse so that the lighting is coming from the top. You'll notice that this gradient fill actually has a mask already. We don't like this mask. This is a raster-based mask. And so I'm going to delete that mask. Copy the vectors from the layer you want to mask. In this case, the base shape layer. Make sure that you have extras shown in Photoshop, which you can see by going into View and hitting Extras, or hitting Command H, because you want access to those vector nodes here. I'm going to go over and choose my direct selection tool, or hitting A, so that I can select all these vector nodes from this base shape. And I'm just going to drag a rectangle around it, and you see it selects all the nodes. I'm going to hit Command C, copy that stuff, and I'm going to select the gradient fill layer and just hit Command V and paste it. And so now we have a vector-based mask instead of a raster-based mask. Vector-based masks are far superior for many reasons. You're just gonna have to take my word for it. We still want to clip this gradient fill to the base shape so that the layer styles that we have applied will be prioritized. And the way that we do that is simply by holding Option and just placing the cursor between the two layers and just left clicking. And there we go, boom. So this gradient might be a little too harsh, and we can change the color by simply going in and changing the gradient. Something like that maybe. I'll make sure to change both points of the gradient down here. There we go, hit OK. I kind of like this, but I think we can improve it. And usually what I end up doing when I create this type of lighting is I stack multiple gradient fills on top of each other until I'm happy. So let's go down and add yet another gradient fill down here, gradient. We're gonna just reverse it, and we're gonna delete the raster mask, and we're gonna paste the vector mask, and we're gonna clip it onto the layer. And for this one, what I want to do is I want to play around with blending modes. I love blending modes. It's really one of the powers of Photoshop. And my favorite blending mode is actually overlay. Now check this out. Look at this. Look at the lighting of this whole thing. This might be a little too harsh, but even if I'm just sort of like flipping this layer on and off, I way better like this color gradient than the one we had from pure white. You can see how the colors are sort of breaking into this teal and then going into the deeper blue. I love that. And we can just drop down the opacity of this layer until we're happy. And here's another quick tip for you. The way that you can drop opacity is basically by selecting any layer and clicking the number pads on your keyboard 1, it's almost barely visible. 5, it's 50% middle of the road. 0, it's 100. I love using the keyboard when I can. I think that's pretty cool. But what this really needs now is shadow, right? And there are so many ways to do shadow. Here's one of my favorite ones. I usually take the layer that I want to cast a shadow and copy it. And here's another quick tip for you. Holding down Option and dragging out any layer will create a duplicate version of that layer. And so now we have a base copy. We can disable the effects from this one. Let's rename it to Shadow. Change the color to like something like black. We want to apply some effects to this. And so we will go in and we will hit Convert to Smart Object. And we're going to go into Filter and we're going to apply Gaussian Blur. There we go. Maybe something like a radius of 10 is fine. It's like a big soft thing. Here you go. It looks like clip art from the 90s. And what we'll then do is drop down the opacity to something a little more manageable. And what I like to do is just offset the shadow just a little bit underneath the shape, kind of like this. And there you go. Look at that thing. Now we kind of have something. It's a shape that definitely has mass, but really it consists of this shadow layer here. If we disable that, we disable the effects on the base shape layer and the 2 gradient fills, and boom, we're left back with just that simple flat shape. So just by adding those things, we kind of create this illusion of an object in space. I think that's really cool. Anyways, we're trying to make the Finder icon here, so let's get back on track. You guys know that the Finder icon has that cube face, right? And really what I could do is just go to the pen tool, hit P, and start to draw out that little shape there. But I'm not gonna make you look through 20 minutes of me tweaking my vectors until I'm happy. So like a good cooking program, I've kind of cheated a little bit, and you'll find a folder in your files called right side. If you enable that, you'll notice this bad boy here. Let me just break it down for you because it's really not that complex and it's built with the exact same tools almost as what we just did. As you can see, this base shape is really just vector. So let's try to build it back up to better understand how to get this effect. First of all, we're adding back in the shadow. It's made in exactly the same way as the shadow we just did. Let's reapply these effects to the base layer and go over them one by one. So first of all, bevel and emboss. It's such a neat way to add like a small highlight or a small shadow to an edge, in this case both. You can see if I enable it and disable it, it sort of creates that subtle light there. We're using inner glow just like we did before, which I feel adds like the illusion of the edge of this thing having some curvature. And then we're dropping shadow, and shout out to when the Photoshop team announced that we could stack multiple layer styles. I was in the crowd that day and I went wild. Multiple drop shadows is nice. Here we have sort of a multiply, which is a pretty hard shadow right underneath. And then we have another multiply, but with some color in it to sort of like blend it in a little bit more. There you go. So that's the layer styles. Next up, I do something that I do all the time, which is clip on a layer that's similar to the base layer, but it has 0% fill. And that means that we can then apply layer styles that affect the shape underneath. Let me show you. So again, I'm adding a bevel and emboss to this layer, and so it's applying that to the shape underneath. One last thing to round off this new face area of the icon is a little technique I use all the time to add some tactility. Let's do it as a quick tip. Are your icons way too flat? Do you need a little bit of tactility in your life? Try noise. I'm just gonna go up here and choose a rectangle tool and just drag out a square shape. Then I'm gonna go and convert that rectangle to a smart object. And then I'm gonna go into filter, and I'm gonna go into noise, add noise. I usually go with something like the max amount, and I'm going with the monochromatic because I don't really want the colors in there. I just want black and white, and hit OK. Now you have a really noisy picture. But the cool thing is this thing, we can call it noise, this layer. You can choose something like overlay, and you can clip it onto things like this face area. And then you can drop down the opacity. And look at that. You start to see that this noise layer actually kind of creates some definition in this shape. It looks like it's made from a real material. Okay, the Finder icon is almost done. But of course, we need to put a smile on his face. Here's how you do that. Enable this layer. Look into this folder. It's literally just 3 shape layers. I apply a few effects to them to make them appear as they're sort of inset into the material. And that's it. That's our little guy. That's the Finder icon. These little techniques can be used to create dimensional buttons in UI and to create hierarchy in content. I use this stuff all the time. Now let's crank it up a notch. Let's see if you guys can guess in the chat or in the comments what I'm about to make. This is just a white base shape with a few of the tricks that we already looked at. Okay, let's add some fun to this. Just gonna drag out a boring old rounded rectangle, and I want it to be orange. We want it to be kind of like pill shaped, and we can use the live shape properties up here and just write a very large number to basically create a pill shape right there. So now we want to try to mimic a slightly more difficult material. We want to apply some effects to this layer. I'm going to apply an inner shadow here and here. Both of these are identical, just coming from two angles really. And I'm using a blending mode that I rarely use, which is vivid light, but it gives these really interesting highlights, and I use it specifically for this material. Then we're going to add an inner glow. Good old using multiply to create an inner shadow all around, just to raise the whole shape up from the background. Then we'll come down, we'll add a drop shadow, and I'm just dropping a multiply shadow with a bit of orange, just to sort of create the illusion that the base shape is casting off some of its color onto the environment. I love that little detail. Then we're dropping a classic shadow onto that. Have you guys guessed this yet? You guys have, right? You're so good. What I want to do is I want to drop the fill opacity down to like 60%, right? Because I kind of want to see through material. You're starting to see this sort of thing come alive, right? I want to add one last little detail to this. I want to add a gradient layer with just sort of a little bit of normal color just added there to the top. There we go. Look at that thing. That, my friends, is colored glass. Let's make some more. There we go, a very glassy version of the photos icon. And literally all of this is made with like 8 shape layers. We can just remove the effect from these layers. You're sort of just left with these colored blobs, right? But really, with the power of layer styles in Photoshop, we're able to take these 8 shapes and turn them into intersecting glass discs. They're see-through, their effects interact with each other, and it really just all comes together in this really nice little icon here. I wonder what's missing here. Can't really put my finger on it. Oh wait, I know. It's our good old friend, gloss. Well, first of all, we're gonna need some shapes. Drag out a wonderful round white shape. We're gonna drop the fill down, then we're gonna go into layer styles. And what we want is a bit of light just coming from above there. The easiest way to do that is simply just to add a gradient. Now, I don't want it to be an overlay, just good old screen, I think. And the cool thing about gradients like this is that you can just move them around, manipulate them any way you want. Had this been like a radial gradient, kind of like this, we would be able to move around the radial gradient, kind of like controlling a light source, right? But let's go with a linear gradient. Just kind of want like just the half of the circle covered in a gradient. I also usually, when I do gloss, add just a little bit of an edge to it. So maybe like an inner shadow, and just sort of have like a little sliver of more solid light there at the top. Let's tweak these vectors just a little more. I personally prefer when you can see like a subtle edge of the gloss layer. Also just adding another gloss layer up here. When you look at things like gloss and other details in icons really close up, it can look a little weird, right? It's like, it doesn't really look right. But what you have to keep in mind is that most app icons will be shown in a much smaller scale. And so what I usually get in the habit of is zooming out and trying to sort of look at the icon from afar. And here's a little quick tip to make that even easier for you. Instead of zooming in and out all the time like a Neanderthal, I usually just go up into Window, Arrange, and then come down to New Window for music.psd. I now have 2 instances open of the same file. I can just drag out one here. And so I'll be working on details over here, changing things, tweaking this maybe, and I'll be able to see those details reflected in the smaller size right here. And it's the same file that I'm editing. So that's another little quick tip for you. Do you guys remember the good old days of iTunes? I love that icon. Let's see if we can travel back in time and add just a little bit of that retro goodness to this music icon. Inside this session file that we've been working on, there's another folder hiding right here called iTunes Classic. Are you guys ready for the reveal? Boom. Let's break it down. So first of all, coming down here in our layers pane, you'll notice that I have a folder called CD. Now this sort of CD effect actually consists of a bunch of different layers, but nothing too complex that we haven't already covered, really. You have your basic Michael style shadow down here. Then we have like the little inner part of the CD right here. We have the CD itself here, and we also have a bit of an overlay to the CD. And so I feel like if we disable this layer, we haven't really burned anything to the CD just yet. Those of you in the audience that's old enough, you know. What I wanted to focus on in this icon is this cool laser disc effect. It's literally just a gradient overlay. And yeah, it's a pretty complex gradient. It has quite a lot of different color nodes, and it takes a little bit of experimentation to get exactly what you want here. But when you look at it, it's really just a bunch of rainbow colors. Pulling any of these color stops around will change how the light appears to be hitting the CD. You'll notice how the music note itself reflects into the CD if you really zoom in here. How do we do that? Well, I simply just took the music note itself, duplicated it, created a smart object from it, moved it down a little bit, and just dropped down the opacity to something like 20. And I used the vectors of the CD and pasted it onto the layer so that that's actually masked, so that the reflection only happens on the surface of the CD. So those are some fun materials, and they literally are all made with just shape layers and layer styles in Photoshop. I think that's kind of amazing. What if we wanted to go even further and really add some fake 3D elements, right? Surely we can't do that with just shapes and layer styles, right? Let's put that to the test. Let's make a really nice notes icon. So we'll just get started with the pen tool here and create a base shape that we can work from. Maybe we'll sort of just kind of create something like this. I'll add some notes. We'll add another one here just to give it a little swing. Maybe one down here. I kind of just want, you know, that part of the paper to look like it's like peeling off the page. We also want another shape just immediately underneath it, which should be sort of like the layer that we can apply some shadow detail to. And so for the peeling part, we probably want some other color that we can easily change and edit. For the layer underneath, we kind of want like an even darker version of that. And we're just gonna add some effects to this, right? You start to see the outlines of this thing, but it looks kind of flat and weird, doesn't really sell the whole concept of 3D, right? So again, layer styles to the rescue, add some shadow that's coming from underneath that peeled part of the paper. So that's simply just a gradient overlay right there. And then we add the good old noise, because I want the whole piece to have that paper texture. For the peeling part of the paper, we're gonna add a couple of effects. First of all, we need a gradient to really sell the depth of this thing. So just kind of adding in a basic overlay gradient. You can study it right here. What I would also like is for this peel to feel kind of thicker, like it has just a little bit of volume. And one easy way to do that is to add a small highlight from the top, mimicking light hitting that imaginary edge. And we do that with inner shadow in this case. I also want the page peel to drop a shadow immediately underneath. Now, this is looking pretty good, but I think we can push it even further. And for this, I think we need another quick tip. Welcome to Michael's guide for point lights and point shadows in Photoshop. So we've looked at using various forms of gradients to create lighting and shadow conditions, but sometimes you want even finer control than what gradients are able to give you. Here's what I do in those conditions. You're gonna come down here and just add a new layer. Go up here and choose the brush tool, or simply just hit B. Here's another quick tip for you. Can we do a quick tip inside a quick tip? Quick tipception? I think so. Let's try it. When you want to paint something with the brush in Photoshop and you have to change brush sizes, you usually have to come all the way up here, go down here and change some of these settings here to change the size of the actual brush. No more. Holding down Control and Option and left clicking and dragging your mouse horizontally across the screen, you can change the diameter of the brush. And if you drag up and down, you'll change the hardness of the brush. Back to the other quick tip. So using the brush tool in this layer that we created before, we just want to click a single time. And what I usually do is I convert this to a smart object. And so now we kind of have like this light that we can move around. And also it doesn't have to be a completely symmetrical point light. You can just hit Command T, and while holding down Shift, we're then allowed to do these odd-sized transformations, and we can create like a really like long stroke of light, for example, and we can use that in a pretty flexible way to add light to this scene. And that's exactly what I've done with this fold. Cool. Okay, that's a page peel. You didn't think I'd sort of just write you guys off with the page peel, right? No, let's add a cool object to this. So a pencil, just like any other object, consists of a few base layers. And so I'll go up here, I'll choose a rounded rectangle, sort of try to get the the composition right. I kind of want the pencil to be juxtapositioned on top of the whole icon. What we can then do is we can just sort of start to draw in the basic components that we need. So we know that we want a body of the pencil. We probably need like a tip for the pencil. And I'm just applying like some base colors for now. It's like a very crude drawing of a pencil, right? I'm not gonna bore you with me just drawing out all these vector shapes. But when you're done, you might have something like this. Let's start to apply some layer styles to this thing and see if we can really make it pop off the page, make it feel like a real object resting on this notepad. First of all, let's apply a good old shadow to the whole thing, made exactly the same way as you've seen me do before. Already that helps the whole thing pop out a little bit. We're gonna start down here by the tip of the pencil because I really wanna show you one other trick that I use quite often, and that is applying textures and masking them onto these base shape layers. And in this case, I have this picture of some plywood, which I've just dragged into Photoshop, turned it into a smart object, and masked it onto this base shape layer here. I'm using the blending mode soft light. Could have been an overlay as well if I wanted the effect to be a little less subtle. We're gonna go with soft light. And as usual, we're using good old layer styles to help us with the illusion of 3D. We've got a little bit of an inner shadow here. We've got an inner glow, and we've got a gradient overlay, which is being used to create this highlight here in the middle. That's pretty much it. Okay, moving on up to the actual body of the pencil. Pretty simple stuff. The inner shadow and the gradient overlay is just there to create this illusion of roundness, really. But of course, another hallmark of a good classic pencil is sort of these angled edges. And so the way that I've done them in this case is actually to divide the body up into 3 sub-shapes. I'm just gonna apply them right here. There you go. Individually, they're just smaller shape layers clipped onto this base shape with some effects applied. You have a little gradient here, and then we have this middle shape here, which needed to be pretty prominent. And I'm using a combination of gradients to sort of create the illusion of light hitting that angled surface, right? And so if I click these on and off, you'll sort of get the sense that, oh, it's actually angled, when really it's not, it's just a shape. Also, good old bevel and emboss, like the boss, casting a little highlight overlay. Moving on up to this metal band across the top of the pencil here. You probably guessed it. We're gonna do this with gradients. A bevel and emboss as the top highlight. A gradient overlay, which is of course where the magic happens. You have a bunch of different color stops, and together they magically create this illusion of light hitting a metallic surface. The eraser at the end of the pencil. And again, we're just applying some very basic layer styling, a little bit of inner glow and inner shadow to create that dimensionality we've been talking about. A little bit of light using the point light method that I showed you before, and then just some noise to really sell you on this idea of it being textured. And there you have it. That's a pencil that looks kind of 3D to me, with literally just a few shape layers and some layer styles. We bend light and we create any material. Side note, it's kind of funny and full circle that one of the very first app icons I ever designed in Photoshop was a notes app icon, like living as a student in my apartment in Copenhagen and making ends meet. And now, 15 years later, I'm teaching you at Adobe MAX, the world's largest creativity conference, how to make that very same thing. I think that's pretty cool. What I think makes Photoshop such a special application is this mastery of both vector and raster graphics. As you know, vector is graphics defined in terms of points connected by lines and curves to form shapes. Vectors are infinitely scalable and are desirable because of that flexibility. It means that if we have a vector shape, we can scale it infinitely without any loss or degradation to that shape. Now, raster graphics, on the other hand, is pixel-based or a bitmap. It's a data set displayed in a rectangular grid. It contains that information, but no more, meaning that when you scale up raster graphics, you'll see degradation of quality, also sometimes referred to as pixelation. Now, all the shapes that we made in this session is vector, whereas all the layer styles that we've applied is raster data that Photoshop generates on the fly. Now, it's important to understand this distinction. I recreated some of the Apple emoji set in Photoshop to demonstrate this, and to my knowledge, these icons do not exist in any scalable format. It's a purely raster-based set that tops out at 160 by 160 pixels. So because these emoji are made in the same way as all the other things we've looked at in this session, from shape layers with layer styles applied to it, we can essentially go in and just change the image size here. Let's go down and do 500%. Boom. And if we zoom out, there you have your high-res renders of emoji. You'll find this wonderful piece of scalable poo and a few other emoji in the files for this session. You're welcome. And sure, as long as there's a raster involved, you'll never be able to export strict SVGs. But I still think this is really cool. Where other applications might be really good at handling vectors or lots of dynamic UI components, Photoshop is extremely versatile. And as I have hopefully demonstrated, this combination of techniques makes it an incredible, powerful tool for visual designers. That's unfortunately all we had time for in today's session. I hope I was able to show you at least one thing or one way of using Photoshop that you hadn't thought of before. And if you like this, I really recommend you check out last year's session, which granted has some overlap. Before I leave you, I want to plug one last thing. I've been working on a book about app icon design for the past 4 years, and I'm this close to launching a Kickstarter campaign. And it's a wonderful hardcover book filled with art from this past decade of icon design on iOS. And it's really a celebration of the craft and a preservation of the work produced by so many talented people. Now, and I'd love for you guys to check it out at appiconbook.com. I hope you had fun. Normally, this is when people would come up afterwards with lots of questions, and now it's just chat and comments. Does anyone else miss real-world conferences? I certainly miss hanging out with all you guys. Like, no matter how many of these digital events we do, nothing really beats the adventure and the camaraderie I have experienced at all my years of Adobe MAX. I really hope to see all of you next year. Thank you for tuning in.